All right. Thank you so much, Talant, and thank you all for coming. It's a real honor to be here and talk to you about my work. I'm going to talk a little bit today about part of my dissertation project. This is coming from a later chapter in the project, where I talk about how things are starting to fall apart for people that are living in the city of Ürümchi, which is a large city in northwest China. So I'm going to talk about the sort of identity that these groups of people, Uyghur migrants to the city, that they find in the city, why they come to the city, what freedom means to them, and also the kind of precarious conditions that they find themselves in. This is coming from fieldwork that I did in 2014 and 2015. I'll talk about some things that happened before this and some things that have happened since, but that's the primary focus of this talk. So just to get started, who are the Uyghurs? The Uyghurs are a group of around 10 to 12 million people that live in northwest China, a place that is contentious because it's just now in the process of being colonized by the Chinese state. Uyghurs have lived in this region for over a millennium. They're Turkic Muslim people. They speak a Turkic language. And there's a lot of rapid changes that are happening to their society, and so what I'll be talking about today is some of those changes and how they're responding to them. The major change that's happened is that there's a lot more Han settlers living in their region, in their homeland. This migration began in the 1990s for a variety of reasons. Of course, in China in general, there's a lot of migration happening. It's one of the largest internal migrations in the world. But most of the migration is going east to the Pearl River Delta down here, or to Shanghai and Beijing along the eastern seaboard. But there's also a lot of migration going west. And the reason that people are migrating west is because there's a lot of natural resources in the west. It's a center for oil, natural gas, and coal. And so people are able to find jobs quite easily in those industries. It's also quite profitable. A second reason, though, is that the state is incentivizing a lot of this migration. The state wants to consolidate control over the frontier region. So prior to 1949, the Han population in this region was less than 5%, and now it's approaching 45 to 50%. This control is aimed at the Kazakh and Uyghur population that live in these areas, because the Uyghurs and Kazakhs are seen as potentially disloyal to the Chinese state. The state is primarily a Han institution, because Han is the majority group in China. So once these migrants arrived in the 1990s, they started to build out infrastructure. That was the first real push, was building oil and natural gas pipelines throughout the region. Both in the south and the Uyghur homeland down here, and in the north, which is traditional Kazakh area. They also built roads and railways through this area in order to facilitate extraction of these natural resources, and also to facilitate mass migration into this area of Han migrants who work in industrial farming. They started to open up the land here for cotton production. So that today, 38% of all of the cotton consumed in China is coming from this region and also from the north. So if you're wearing something that says made in China and it's cotton, you have a 38% chance of it being from this region. Now 21 to slightly more percent of the gas consumed in China comes from this region. Some of it's coming through the region from other parts of Central Asia. And oil is also around 20%. Another thing that happened through this development is they started to build roads through the region and into Central Asia, into Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. And this had a large effect on the Uyghur population, because in the early 90s, there was a lot of opportunities for Uyghurs and for Kazakhs to travel outside of the country and do trade with people in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Uyghurs speak a Turkic language that's mutually intelligible with Kyrgyz and Kazakh. That's why Talant could teach me Uyghur. He's a native Kazakh, but he knows Uyghur because he grew up here in Ürümchi. traveling abroad and seeing other groups, other Muslim groups, other Turkic groups, had a strong effect on the Uyghur population. Uyghurs, up to this point, had their own republic in the 1940s and 1930s, but for a number of decades they hadn't really been able to travel freely between countries, and they really had lost touch with people that they see as their Muslim brothers. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were also emerging from the Soviet Union, and so they were founding their own republics during this period, and that also had a strong effect on Uyghur ethnic identity, because they started to think about what could be possible for Uyghurs. Could they have their own state? Basically, we see a large-scale ethnic nationalist revival among Uyghurs during this time. This stopped in 1997 when the borders were closed for Uyghurs, and Uyghurs since then have not been able to travel. But in the 2000s, they began building out the communications infrastructure throughout southern Xinjiang. 3G networks, internet service suddenly became available for all Uyghurs in southern Xinjiang. And so suddenly everyone started buying smartphones. Now almost every Uyghur, especially someone under the age of 30, has a smartphone. And they're using their smartphones to communicate with each other using apps like WeChat, but they're also communicating with people, or at least were, communicating with people abroad, people in Uyghurs that have traveled to Turkey or to other parts of Central Asia. They're also listening to Islamic teachers from Uzbekistan. And so what this exposure did is it facilitated a wide-scale religious transformation among Uyghurs. People just starting to come to terms with what it means to be Muslim, because in China, of course, religious education is tightly controlled, especially for Uyghurs, since they have this history of having a national identity, what is often referred to as a separatist identity. So understanding that other people around the world are practicing Islam in different ways than they are, and that there's other ways of being pious, had a strong effect on them. Mostly they were interested in what might be referred to as Hanafi forms of Islam. It's the most common form of Sunni Islam, basically everywhere in the world. It's not necessarily political in a strong sense. It's mostly focused on pious practice. But there were a small number of people that were also interested in more political forms of Islam, Salafi forms, what you might have heard referred to as fundamentalist forms of Islam. And so, in general, there's a religious transformation, and in the state's eyes, that Salafi form comes to be conflated with a lot of other forms of Islam. And I'll talk more about this as we go along. One of the things that was facilitated by all of this new development in the region and by the communications infrastructure was people in the country started to see that there's different life possibilities, that there's ways of moving and living in the world that they hadn't probably previously really known about. So people in the villages around these cities started moving into these regional cities, Khotan, Kashgar, and Aksu. And then from there, they often started migrating to Ürümchi. So when I began my fieldwork in 2011, I encountered a lot of these migrants coming from the countryside and into the city. It's all still within the same province, but it's a long distance. I don't have a scale here, but it takes 24 hours to travel from here to Ürümchi by bus, which is how most of them got there. So these people that I found in the city describe themselves most broadly as travelers. They use a Uyghur word, which is adapted from Arabic, called musafir, or musafir. This word has a lot of connotations. It in some ways refers to something similar to the Chinese term, Mangniu, which means blind wanderer, or something like that. It's translated in different ways. Could also be blind floater. And as part of the Liudong Renko, or the floating population. But it has more connotations than simply that. It's not, because that has a particular kind of Maoist history and a particular sort of social categorization attached to it that comes pretty strongly from the Chinese state and from Han culture. For Uyghurs, the term musafir has other connotations as well, religious and psychic connotations. It means migrant, it means economic migrant, it means refugee, it means a kind of homeless person, Homeless in the sense that, as in not rooted in place. They often have homes, but their homes are viewed as sort of temporary. It's also associated with Sufi traditions, with the Sufi wanderer tradition, which is the dervish, or the Sufi beggar, the kalender, so people that travel from town to town, following a path, a Sufi path, teaching others through oral tradition, and sometimes begging or asking for hosts to give them gifts. They're seen as sort of set apart from other parts of other segments of the society. And this is quite traditional, and it's something that has been quite tightly controlled by the state over the last, since 1949, really. But it's still there, and it's still something that everyone is aware of. For me, this term really describes, or I'm using the term to describe, undocumented, underemployed, rural origin, religious, Uyghur migrant businessmen in the city. And these people are primarily young, between the ages of 20 and 30. Some of them are married, many of them are not, and they're primarily male. And this has to do with the gender politics in Uyghur society. Women traveling alone are seen as unsafe and possibly immoral from the perspective of the parents. And so women are often kind of kept back at home while men are incentivized and sometimes asked to travel to support their family back in the countryside. And so this shows up in the population demographics of the city as well. So when these people arrived in the city, they lived primarily in these areas of the city, the areas I've outlined in red. This is a goat herding mountain. Some people also refer to as Evil Spirit Mountain. It's ambiguous as to where the name of the mountain comes from. And also in this area next to the Grand Bazaar. And down here next to the bus station. People come on the bus or they come on the train, and as they get off the train, there's these settlements nearby. These settlements were pretty much intact until 2009, when there was large-scale protests throughout the city, protests that turned very violent fairly quickly. Uyghur students from Xinjiang University and high schools nearby took to the streets to protest the mob killing of Uyghur migrant workers in a factory in eastern China. They were killed by Han migrant workers. And the state had not really responded to this killing, and so they took to the streets demanding justice, saying, we're Chinese citizens too. They were carrying Chinese flags. The police responded to this protest with a great deal of violence, and then many Uyghurs joined the protest in what kind of turned into something like a race riot, with Uyghurs destroying Han businesses, beating Han travelers in the city, migrants in the city, and killing a number of people as well. So around 197 people were officially killed during these events, most of them Han. And in the weeks that followed, thousands of Uyghur young men, particularly in these neighborhoods, were rounded up by the police and disappeared. We don't know what's happened to them since. They've simply vanished. In the years that followed, these areas of the city were targeted for urban renewal, which is really sort of a euphemism for urban cleansing, a way of removing an unwanted population of the city through a number of processes. Those that could prove that they had a right to the city were moved from these areas down into this resettlement zone, more on the margin of the city. And some that had a bit of wealth were able to move into subsidized housing in these areas. In this neighborhood, almost all of the new housing is commodity housing. It's being sold to new settlers that have money and can afford it. One of the ways that they began to police the Uyghur migrant population in the city was by introducing this passbook system in 2014. It's called the Yemin-Ka system, or People's Convenience Card. In Uyghur, they often refer to it as a Yeşil Kart, which means green card. And there it was referring both to the color, because green and blue are kind of interchangeable for a lot of Uyghurs, and also to the American green card system, because they saw it as an internal passport. The card has a QR code on it that can be scanned by a smartphone, and then all of your family history will be pulled up, all of your criminal history, your family's criminal history. All the information about you is available to them on this card. So all Uyghur migrants, actually all migrants that have rural Xinjiang hukou, which is household registration in the city in China, all of them were forced to return to their hometowns and get this card. They had to go to the local police station and say, hey, I want this good citizen card so I can go back to the city. This had the effect of causing around 300,000 Uyghur migrants to return to their hometowns to try to get this card. Only around 10%, based on my interviews, were able to get the card. So it was really a way of excluding a population from the city. If you didn't have the card, you weren't permitted to actually leave your home county. And so these migrants that before had been traveling back and forth to the city were no longer allowed to do that. So during my fieldwork, this kind of advertising was common. Vacant Uyghur apartment buildings and apartments in general. Many people were forced to leave. Some were able to get the card, but most were not. And some kind of lived illegally as much as they could in sort of an underground existence. The police were very vigilant in tracking down people that didn't have the card. All right, so that's sort of the context of what I'm going to talk about today, sort of the political and social context of what's happened. The way I'm thinking about the lives of these people is kind of in a broad sense is through the concept of precarity, social precarity, which for me really just means living without institutional support or adequate infrastructure. It also incorporates, in many cases, forms of dispossession, of losing what you have. And what I'm going to argue today in my talk is that by participating in a mosque community in the city that was made up of other travelers, people also from the countryside, Musafirs or travelers were able to participate in a religious economy as a means of preparing for displacement. They knew that they were only going to stay in the city, only be able to stay for a short time, but being part of a community was a way of finding some stability despite that threat. I'm also arguing that the narratives of the migrants that I interviewed are symptomatic of the experience of hundreds of thousands of travelers who failed to claim a secure space in the city. So, what is a religious economy? And there's a broad body of literature on this, particularly in anthropology of religion and religious studies. But in general, it's thought of as a response to the global spread of secularism, the global spread of capitalism. It's the way that the market economy forces people to respond. And it ranges from Christian, Buddhist, and Muslim forms. So in Africa and South America and other places, we see Christian responses to capitalist development and Pentecostal movements and things like that. In East and Southeast Asia, we see Buddhist responses to capitalist forms. Many times it takes on the sort of expression of sort of a prosperity gospel. That being a good Christian is also being a good capitalist. It means being self-disciplined, saving your money, working hard, basically having a Protestant work ethic. But it's been adapted to a lot of different areas and to different religious contexts. Sometimes it's quite institutionalized, where there's actually training courses that you can take to be a good Buddhist business person in places like Taiwan. For Muslims, there's also these sort of training courses and things happening in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. For Uyghurs, it's not able to be formalized in that way because of the political context. Religious activities are quite tightly controlled by the state. And in some cases, in other places, the political circumstances of people's lives also don't really allow for formal religious responses to market economies. And in those cases, it often emerges as a kind of making do, a sort of salvage form of religious response. So for the Uyghurs coming to the city, what they're trying to do is find religious freedom in many cases, because in the countryside, religious practice is even more tightly controlled than in the city. And they're also trying to find jobs. They're trying to enter into the cash economy. And these things kind of commingle, the interest in religious freedom and having kind of economic freedom, finding jobs. They're related to each other, and there's a feedback loop between them. It's important to note that this isn't necessarily an intentional form of politics or like a politics of resistance to the state. People are not practicing Islam because they want to contest what the state is doing necessarily. It's instead, often they're just interested in being pious people, being Muslims, and being contemporary. They want to participate in the world, participate with the broader Muslim community. And of course, they want a better life for their children. They want a better future. One of the things that emerges out of their experience in this religious economy is that there's a kind of relational autonomy, which is something that you could describe as sort of achieve status within a community. So you find a place, a kind of belonging within a community, and that gives you a kind of freedom. Because you're recognized as a member of the community, you have a little bit of authority in relation to other people, and you have ways of kind of finding resources, finding jobs, all of this sort of thing. People also often described it to me as being in this community was a comfort, a tesadi. It was a way of coping with sort of the stress of living in the city and living under the controls of the state. So what does this look like? Well, on Fridays it looks like this. It's Muslim men, mostly migrants, to the city, praying at the mosque, and also listening to the weekly message from the imam. That's a state-appointed imam who gives a speech, a message that about usually moral living, and oftentimes about kind of state politics and how you should be good citizens. People go to the mosque to pray, not really necessarily to listen to this imam, because they see him as teaching something that they don't consider to be real Islam. So instead, a lot of the religious economy is contained in things like this. People sharing messages, what they call tabligh, which are unauthorized Islamic teachings that they've received either from other Uyghur teachers or from people in Uzbekistan or Turkey, sharing them with each other in sort of underground spaces that are near the mosque and in the mosque area, prayer rooms that are often in certain restaurants that people that know how to get into them. They also share messages using WeChat groups. In the prayer rooms, they also often study the Quran using things like this, which is they call Precarity. It's a pen reader. This is coming from Bangladesh, which is also experiencing religious transformations. It allows you to recite, or it recites the Quran for you in Arabic and allows people to memorize what's happening in the Quran. They don't necessarily understand the Arabic, but it's a way of memorizing the Quran, which is part of the Islamic instruction, something that everyone should know more about. Of course, the mosque community also fosters other things. So on the Big Friday prayer day, there's also large bazaars that emerge in the streets around the mosque, where migrants to the city sell products that they brought with them from the countryside, or products that they bought from wholesalers, oftentimes food, but other things as well. Shoes are also a common item that people try to sell. They also connect with other people from the same hometown where they came from in the countryside. So it's a way of building connections and a way of figuring out what to do next. So in the next week, where are day laborers going to be hired to demolish Uyghur settlements or other buildings? That's usually the kind of work that these guys find, not building things, but tearing things down. Or where is the next supply of children's coats from Shenzhen that you can buy and sell out of the back of your cart or whatever you have. So people find ways in this space to kind of hustle and find new jobs. All right, so the neighborhood where I did most of my work was called Black Shell Mountain. It's close to the Grand Bazaar, and it was in the process of being demolished while I was there. I spent a lot of time in the with a man who lived here. He was holding out against having his house demolished. In China, you might refer to it as a nail house, because he wanted better compensation from the government before he left. But this map here or image is I included to show you what the neighborhood looked like in 2002. So it's vernacular housing, very similar to Uyghur vernacular architecture in the southern oasis cities, places like Kashgar. People build these houses in the courtyard manner with using mud and brick. So they're informal in the sense that they don't have permission to build them, but they're very concrete houses. This is what they look like, the ones that are left. They're off the grid as well. There's no water or sewage available to these people, but they've often found ways to get electricity into them. So by 2015, most of the houses had been demolished. Amir's house was one of the ones left, and the mosque was still intact and still very vibrant. On Fridays, thousands of people would come into this neighborhood for the mosque service because it was seen as the traveler's mosque. It's the mosque that was the good one for people that are coming from southern Xinjiang. Amir lived in a small house where he took care of his grandchildren. His son also lived with them. And he was waiting for better compensation. He was also waiting because his livelihood was tied to his sheep. He was a sheep herder. He was raising sheep in his house there. He had 11 sheep that he kept in a little pen near the entrance to his house, and then during the day he would take them out to a small corral that he had built, or maybe it's an abandoned house, I'm not actually sure. And he also would collect refuse or leftover food from the restaurants that were in the mosque neighborhood. This was donated food. Because he was a member of the community, people in the community saw him as someone in need, and they knew he had sheep, so they would donate this food to him. So he would feed them naan, he would feed them whatever they would give him. But he was dependent in that way for kind of on the community for this sort of material support. People in the community also looked out for him. They made sure that his house stayed intact. If there was a windstorm coming, people would show up and secure the tarps and stuff on top of the house. When I talked to him about his life and what it was like to live in this community and what it meant to be a traveler, these are the sort of things that he told me. He said, I've always been a musafir, I've always been a traveler. Even though he came into the city in the 1980s, he'd been living there a long time, he still considered himself a traveler. But he said, now we're truly becoming without home and hearth. Oyachaksiz. And he referenced a very common saying that a lot of Uyghurs referenced to me, is that until you become a traveler, you can't be a true Muslim. Musafir bulmagcha, Musliman bulmas. What they mean by this, and what he meant in particular, was that until you become dependent on the community of other believers, you can't really understand what it means to truly be Muslim. And so as a way of kind of justifying and valorizing his position as a traveler in the city in a religious and sort of pious sense. For him, the Musafir community allowed him to kind of have a sort of relational autonomy, which meant that he felt like he had chosen his life path, he had chosen to be there. He didn't just accept what had been given to him. Instead, he had really sought and struggled. And it also meant that he had a certain standing in the community. He was a respected elder. People looked up to him, and they looked out for him. And he was very worried that if he left his home, that he would lose this community. So over the year that I spent with him, just visiting once or twice a week, we've talked about all kinds of strategies for him to keep his home. I had a lot of filmmaker and artist friends, so I brought some of them in to meet him, and we discussed making a documentary film about what he was going through and how he is like living this lifestyle as a farmer in the city. But he felt like we couldn't do that because there's a sort of strategic invisibility in his position. If the state understands that he's resisting, if he makes too much noise, if he makes the state lose face, then they would treat him more harshly, he felt. And so he just waited and waited for better accommodation. He would have liked to move into these apartments, but the compensation that they were giving him was simply a discount on the square meters of these new apartments. Rather than paying 8,000 yuan per square meter, they would give him the discount of 5,000 per square meter, which he couldn't even come close to affording. And so he was waiting for an apartment that would be free, but he anticipated that it would be far away. So towards the end of the year that I spent talking with him, he said, "Our time has become short. Next month, we are moving into a big building on the outskirts of the city. I can't take the sheep with us, so I'll have to sell them. I've been raising sheep here for almost 40 years. There is nothing in those new houses. They are just bare. Of course, they will have water inside, so it will be more convenient, but we will have to pay for everything: water, heat, electric. It is just a money-eating house. The worst thing about this situation is there is no mosque in that area. We have no choice. This is the government we have. They just take what they want and tell us what to do. They won't give us money for our house and let us decide for ourselves. This government just takes from us Uyghurs and gives to the Han. They are making our lives harder and harder. We don't have any choice. We have pain from all sides, but God will provide." So on May 1st, 2 weeks after he told me that, his house was demolished and he was forced to move, sell his sheep and move. He moved around 15 kilometers away from this community. All right, so I'm going to